I can't breathe. But the officer with the knee on his neck didn't do anything. He calmly and deliberately kept up the pressure, even after he stopped breathing, for 2 more minutes. I can't breathe. But 3 officers just stood and watched. They stood there and watched. All 3 calmly and deliberately stood there and watched. I can't breathe. A 17-year-old girl calmly stood her ground. She bravely and deliberately kept filming so that no one could deny the truth. She will probably wake from nightmares for the rest of her life, having watched the last breath leave George Floyd's body. Gwen Carr saw the news, her breath taken away. Not again. Her son, Eric Garner, had repeatedly cried out the same words, I can't breathe. Mr. Garner, because he sold some loose cigarettes. Mr. Floyd, because he might have used a counterfeit $20 bill, perhaps to buy some Skittles and iced tea. And for that, the officer put his knee on his neck. Now, note the neck, just like a noose at a lynching. And the officer listened as Mr. Floyd cried out to his dead mama. Please help me, he cried, as all 3 other officers calmly and deliberately stood there and watched. George's only hope was his dead mother. In response, the community lost its collective breath. You know how sometimes when you cry so hard you can't breathe? You know, sometimes how when you are so angry you stop breathing, you have to be reminded, breathe. And so once again the community took a collective breath and went back to the streets, shouting, no justice, no peace, drawing deep breaths to make their voices heard, demanding accountability. And it was black, brown, and white bodies together. It was a scene of unity. We understood that sometimes property damage comes as the language of the unheard, as Dr. King described. And it may seem absurd, but what is absurd? A life in exchange for a $20 bill. But it escalated into something more. This is different. This is coordinated. Are some of the white bodies there not to offer support, but to use the opportunity to sow further division, to allow us to trot out talking points about black anger, to justify taking the breath away from men like George Floyd? And immediately the questions came. What had he done to bring about his own death? Had he ever been to jail? And the explanations, probably had a gun. You mean like those white men who had Confederate flags and AK-47s and AR-15s strapped around their necks? That kind of having a gun? Oh, he resisted arrest. But thank goodness for that 17-year-old girl, because we know all those excuses are false. Now, ironically, protections against coronavirus meant masks shielded some of the faces, white faces deliberately provoking violence. Not that they're the exclusive reason for rioting and looting, but who stood to gain from the spectacle? Who could now trot out the old and tired canards about law and order, promising vicious dogs? You mean like those who tore at the flesh of women and children in Birmingham? And promising that when the looting begins, the shooting begins? You mean like that racist sheriff in the 60s? Doesn't it make you so angry you can't breathe? Aren't you so destroyed by your tears that you can't breathe? And if not, if you can hear this without crying, if you can hear this without rage, are you paying attention? Or perhaps you haven't paid attention for years and years and decades and centuries of the same violence playing over and over like a loop. But I believe you do care. Perhaps feeling paralyzed, uncertain, afraid. What can we possibly do? First, we can recognize this is all about protecting whiteness. White supremacy is not about men and women parading around in white robes, but it is the very system upon which our country was built. Wealth that's been passed down for generations because our mothers could buy houses on the desired side of the red line. Wealth handed down for generations and includes profits made off the backs of slaves. Our wealth includes the education our families were afforded while schools were segregated. That's jobs, education, access to capital, and though many decades ago, perhaps, means white wealth today is many more times that of black wealth. Secondly, we can stop saying, "I'm not racist." If we aren't anti-racist, then we're perpetuating the problem. 3, we can keep saying the names. Like we read the names of those who perished on September 11th, we can keep reciting the names of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and that's just from the last few weeks. We could build a new Vietnam War-style memorial to stretch the distance of the mall in Washington, D.C. to remember all the names like Sandra Bland and Walter Scott and Tamir Rice and Michael Brown, and I'm losing my breath. 4th, we can vote. We can make sure every citizen in the country at every level of government, not just the president, votes to end the systems that perpetuate violence against people of color, whether through mass incarceration or unequal access to health care, both of which are killing people with coronavirus at disturbingly unequal rates. But 5th, we can pray. We can pray to the Creator who put breath into the first human being. The second creation story in the book of Genesis says, "The Lord God formed the human from the topsoil of fertile land and blew life's breath into their nostrils." Breath is a gift of God. And you know how sometimes when you cry so hard you can't breathe? And you know how sometimes you can be so angry you stop breathing? And that sometimes we have to be reminded to breathe. You know that's simply praying. That's returning to the source of breath. I know I can't fully breathe. I can't take a deep enough breath if I don't return often enough to prayer and meditation and worship. Worship that's not about getting into heaven and escaping all this mess, but participating in building God's open, inclusive, just, and compassionate world here on earth as it is in heaven. Breathe. Breathe. Because breath itself is a gift of the one who gave us life and sustains our lives. Take a breath. Take a breath and get into this struggle. Amen.